History isn't just a record of the past, it's a puzzle filled with secrets, questions, and truths buried on purpose. Welcome to the channel, where we go beyond the surface, challenge the official stories, and uncover the mysteries the world was never supposed to remember. If you love lost civilizations, hidden timelines, ancient technology, and shocking historical evidence, you're exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a discovery that could change what we think we know about history. And watch till the end, because the final reveal is always what ties the entire mystery together. The truth doesn't show up in the first minute, it shows up in the last one. Now, let's get into the video. 12,000 years ago, Earth was a very different world. Not just in the way it looked, but in the way it lived. At the end of the last ice age, our planet was locked in a deep freeze. Massive ice sheets, some more than 2 miles thick, covered North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. Sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than they are today. What is now the ocean floor was once exposed land, wide and fertile, rich with rivers, lakes, forests, and life. Entire lost coastlines existed. Island chains that are now buried beneath the sea stretched into the distance. Places that today we call myths were once real geography. Humanity did not live in a world separated by oceans. The continents were connected by land bridges. Animals migrated freely between what is now Siberia and Alaska. Ancient humans walked from Asia into the Americas, without boats, without maps, without borders. But this quiet, frozen world was not peaceful. It was a world waiting for disaster. Because unknown to the humans, mammals, and megafauna that roamed the earth, time was running out. Something was coming. Something that would kill nearly everything. Something that would drown the world. Not slowly. Not over thousands of years. But violently, rapidly, and with a level of destruction so total that all future civilizations would inherit only stories, legends of a flood so massive that it nearly erased humanity itself. A planet at its breaking point. The Earth, 12,000 years ago, was not just frozen, it was unstable. Locked inside those ice sheets was more than 20 million cubic kilometers of water. Enough to raise sea levels across the entire planet by more than 120 meters. But water wasn't all that was trapped in the ice. Frozen inside the glacier were massive amounts of methane, carbon, an ancient biological material, a time bomb of climate-altering gases just waiting for release. Scientists call this era the late Pleistocene, and to most people it sounds uneventful: cold climate, mammoths, cave lions, primitive humans. But the evidence shows something different. The Ice Age was already warming, slowly. Something was changing in the atmosphere, the oceans, the jet streams, the seasons. Then, suddenly, the warming stopped. The world plunged back into a deep freeze. Almost overnight. This event is known as the Younger Dryas, one of the most mysterious climate reversals in Earth's history. Temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Ecosystems collapsed. Megafauna died in massive numbers. A global drought followed by global freezing gripped the Earth. Something triggered it. Something powerful enough to change the entire planet in a geological instant. And whatever that event was, it is directly connected to the flood that came later. The silent years before the fall. For more than 1,000 years after the Younger Dryas began, the world remained locked in harsh conditions. Most of North America was buried under a sheet of ice larger than India. Europe was frozen tundra. Only small pockets of land near the equator remained lush enough for large life to survive. Human civilizations, if they existed, would have been pushed into the tropics, living in isolated zones of warmth. Most of the Earth was uninhabitable. But something else was happening. Something few people today ever learn in school. Human populations did not disappear. They grew. Humanity was not just surviving, it was adapting. Stone tools advanced. Hunting systems improved. Evidence shows that humans were working with fibers, textiles, fishing systems, complex weapons, shelters, and maybe even early forms of ocean navigation. In other words, humans were not primitive cavemen. They were intelligent problem solvers living through the most extreme environmental conditions the species had ever faced. But they were not prepared for what would come next. No one was. Because after more than 1,000 years of freezing conditions, the world snapped. Something changed. Something triggered the end of the Ice Age in a single geological moment. And what followed was the greatest flood event in recorded planetary history. Water waved the beginning of the end. Every scientist studying ancient climate agrees on one thing. Something catastrophic happened around 11,600 years ago. The ice sheets began to collapse. Not slowly, but violently. Rivers of meltwater burst from beneath the glacier like exploding dams. Ocean levels did not simply rise, they surged. In less than 1,000 years, the oceans rose by over 400 feet. That wasn't a flood. That was the world drowning. Massive coastal regions, where most life and most human populations lived, disappeared forever beneath the sea. Ancient forests, animal habitats, land bridges, valleys, and plains were swallowed. Over the span of a single human lifetime, shorelines retreated miles inland. Villages, hunting grounds, entire landscapes vanished and never returned. If humans were living in organized structures, even simple ones, they would have watched their world disappear beneath rising water. That kind of event becomes more than history. It becomes legend. It becomes the flood. But what triggered it? This is the question scientists still debate today. What finally melted the ice? What caused the younger Dryas freeze, and then the sudden ending of it? Why did mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, and hundreds of species vanish forever? Why did sea levels rise so suddenly that they reshaped the world? There are three leading scientific theories. White-Heavy Mark Theory 1, a massive comet impact. Some scientists believe a giant asteroid or comet struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, exploding in the atmosphere and triggering wildfires, climate collapse, and instant melting. Evidence. Black matte layer found worldwide, filled with nanodiamonds and melted spherules. Signs of massive wildfires across North America. Shocked quartz and impact debris in geological layers. If true, the impact may have hit an ice sheet, causing instant melt and global flooding. White-Heavy Mark Theory 2, mega eruptions plus volcanic winter. Others argue that supervolcanoes erupted in a chain reaction, pumping ash into the sky, blocking sunlight, collapsing ecosystems, and then triggering rapid warming later. Examples: Larger Sea, Icelandic volcanism, Yellowstone activity. But volcanic activity alone doesn't explain the sudden meltwater pulse. White-Heavy Mark Theory 3, the ice dam collapse. The more traditional scientific model is this. As Earth warmed, giant lakes trapped under the ice sheet, like glacial lake gases, suddenly burst, releasing more water than every river on Earth combined. This is called Meltwater Pulse 1A, a real, measured event. It raised global sea levels by 20 meters in less than 400 years. That's enough water to erase entire continents. But the mystery remains. What triggered the collapse? Because the timing is too precise. The climate change, the extinctions, the ocean rise, the black matte layer, the sudden disappearance of megafauna, and the start of new human civilizations. All happened at the same moment in geological time. Which means something enormous, must have started it. And the world knew it. Because even though you said no ancient written sources, the scientific fact still stands. Every continent has a memory of a flood. But in this documentary, we will prove it scientifically, without mythology, without religion, without legends. Only evidence. Because this is not a story about belief. This is a story about what the Earth itself recorded. Telescope, the investigation begins. In the next chapters, we will follow the scientific trail of evidence. White-Heavy Mark ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica. White-Heavy Mark geological flood deposits around the world. White-Heavy Mark sea level rise data recorded in ocean sediment. White heavy check mark mass extinction signatures in fossil layers. White heavy check mark the younger Dryas climate breakdown. White heavy check mark the mysterious layer of cosmic debris found worldwide. White heavy check mark the sudden rise of advanced human settlements after the flood. Because the truth is not hidden in myths. It is hidden in the earth. And the earth remembers everything. It did not begin with thunder. It did not begin with rain. It began with silence. A silence so unnatural that the animal sensed it first. For thousands of years, the earth had been locked in a frozen state, the younger Dryas, the last sudden return to glacial cold. But then, for reasons still debated today, something shifted in the atmosphere. Something so powerful, so sudden, that it forced the planet out of an ice age almost overnight. The Great Melt had begun. But this was not a gentle warming. This was a global destabilization event, the kind of shift the planet experiences only once every 100,000 years. The ice sheets did not simply melt from the top downward. They failed from underneath. Water, trapped between earth and ice, began to move. Pressure built. Enormous subterranean lakes, locked in geological cages for millennia, started to rupture. The world was about to discover what 20 million cubic kilometers of frozen water looks like when released too fast. The first warning signs. For most animals and early humans, the change was invisible at first. The air felt different. Wind shifted. Snow that once lingered into summer began melting faster. But in the far north, deep inside what is now Canada, something enormous was forming beneath the ice. A lake the size of the modern Mediterranean. A lake scientists now call glacial Lake Agassiz. It was a body of water larger than all the Great Lakes combined. But it was not a lake in the open. It was locked under miles of ice, sealed in by frozen walls holding back more water than all the rivers on Earth today. And those walls were weakening. Across the planet, temperatures were rising at a speed no earlier climate cycle could explain. Ice cores drilled from Greenland offer proof, trap bubbles of air show carbon dioxide rising, methane releasing, and temperatures spiking in as little as 20 years. Earth was not warming slowly. It was lurching into a new state of being. Something had set off a chain reaction, one that could not be reversed. Explosion symbol possibility of a trigger event. Scientists have debated what event, or combination of events, triggered this sudden shift. But one thing is clear. The melt was not natural. Something accelerated it. Something forced the ice to collapse far faster than normal orbital warming cycles. Because under normal planetary rhythm, ice ages end slowly, over thousands of years. But the younger Dryas ended in decades, maybe even in a single generation. That kind of shift requires energy. A lot of energy. Some scientists point to a cosmic trigger, a comet or fragmented asteroid that may have struck the ice sheets, instantly vaporizing trillions of tons of ice and releasing catastrophic meltwater. Others believe it was volcanic eruptions, blocking sunlight, triggering atmospheric swings, and releasing heat once the ash settled. Others point to geothermal melting below the ice, ancient heat pulses from Earth's mantle warming the base of glacier. But whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. Water began moving beneath the ice. And once ice sheet collapse begins, there is no stopping it. Water waved the first mega flood. It happened fast. At some point around 11,600 years ago, the ice dam holding back glacial Lake Agassiz gave way. It did not break, it exploded. A wall of water hundreds of feet tall burst out and flooded the land, carving giant channels through Canada and the northern United States. Entire regions were erased in hours. Boulders the size of houses were rolled across the land like pebbles. The force of the water was so extreme, so unstoppable, that it permanently altered the geography of North America, leaving scars visible from space today. Scientists call this a meltwater pulse, and it sent so much water into the ocean so quickly that coastlines around the world instantly changed. Sea levels jumped. Weather systems shifted. Ocean currents reorganized. And Earth's climate snapped into chaos. Globe showing America's the global impact. This was not a local disaster. This was a planetary tipping point. The sudden release of meltwater into the North Atlantic shut down the thermohaline circulation, the system that regulates global ocean temperature. With that disruption came white heavy checkmark violent monsoons. White heavy checkmark mega droughts in once fertile lands. White heavy checkmark hyper hurricanes forming on overheating seas. White heavy checkmark entire animal species disappearing. White heavy checkmark sudden migrations of human populations. White heavy checkmark massive changes in global vegetation and ecosystems. The Earth was no longer cooling. It was collapsing into instability. And as the glacier continued to melt, the oceans continued to rise, sometimes as much as 10 feet in a single century. That doesn't sound dramatic today. But imagine, if sea levels rose 10 feet right now, every coastal city on Earth would flood: New York, London, Shanghai, Tokyo, Mumbai, Lagos, Sydney, Rio. Hundreds of millions displaced. Every map redrawn. Now multiply that by 10,000 years. That's what ancient humans lived through. That's why they remembered it. That's why they never forgot it. Elephant: the end of the giants. As the world warmed, something else happened, something we still see the evidence of in fossil beds across the globe. The great mammals began to die. Mammoths. Mastodons. Giant ground sloths. Dire wolves. Saber-toothed cats. American lions. Woolly rhinoceros. Camelops. Glyptodon, armadillos the size of cars. More than half of all large animal species went extinct at the end of the Younger Dryas. Not gradually. Suddenly. Some disappeared so fast that scientists still find them frozen in perfect condition, food still in their mouths, fur intact, bodies locked in ice as if death came instantly. This was not normal extinction. This was the signature of global trauma. Something killed them. And whether it was environmental collapse, starvation, disease, or a cosmic-triggered catastrophe, one truth remains. Humans survived. The giants did not. Which means early humans were not destroyed by the flood. They were changed by it. Forced to migrate. Forced to rebuild. Forced to remember. Humans on the move. As coastlines flooded and ecosystems shifted, humans were pushed into new environments. Valleys where they once hunted became lakes. Shorelines where they once lived sank beneath the water. Rivers rerouted. Forests died. New deserts formed. And one of the most mysterious things in archaeology happened. Human settlements began to appear suddenly in multiple disconnected regions of the world, around the same time the Ice Age ended. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. The oldest known megaliths in the world. Built just after the flood period. Jericho, one of the world's first cities. Built after the Great Melt. Ancient submerged ruins off India, Japan, Cuba, and the Bahamas, all beneath more than 100 feet of water today. Something, or someone, was building again. Not slowly, but with memory. As if rebuilding what was lost. As if trying to restart what had been drowned. The human survival mystery. Genetic evidence shows that humanity nearly went extinct long before this, but not during the flood. We survived the climate collapse. We adapted faster than the megafauna. Why? Because unlike mammoths, humans didn't depend on a single environment. They could move, relocate, invent, and rebuild. And in a world where the sea was rising relentlessly, where forests were drowning, where the old world was vanishing, human memory became the most valuable resource on Earth. Those who remembered the coastlines before they sank. Those who knew where the rivers once flowed. Those who understood the stars, the seasons, the cycles, were the ones future civilizations would follow. The flood did not reset humanity. It reshaped it. Left pointing magnifying glass. What comes next in this story? Part 1 revealed the frozen world before the flood. Part 2 revealed how the melt began, the first collapse, the first flood pulse, the extinction waves, the end of the great mammals. But the worst is still ahead. Because the first flood was not the only one. There were multiple. And one of them was so large, so destructive, that it buried entire regions under hundreds of feet of water in a single event. In the next chapter, we follow the evidence of that event, the strongest scientific candidate for the true Great Flood of 12,000 years ago. Not the first meltwater pulse, but the largest one. The one that drowned the world. The first flood was devastating. But it was not the Great Flood. The world had already begun to melt. Glacier had collapsed. Megafauna had died. Humanity had scattered. But the Earth was not finished. Because the most destructive part of the event had not happened yet. The flood that erased coastlines. The flood that turned valleys into oceans. The flood that erased entire chapters of human history. Was still coming. What happened next was not a single disaster, but a global chain reaction, one that pushed the Earth into the final stage of the Great Melt. Something triggered a second, even more violent pulse of ocean rise, one so extreme that geologists can still measure it in the world's ancient shorelines. This event is known today as Water Wave Meltwater Pulse 1b. The largest single rise of sea levels in the last 130,000 years. A rise so sudden, so unstoppable, that it pushed the world into the modern age of water, the age where seas reached their current height. And never went back down. Globe showing Europe, Africa, the world before the final flood. By the time Meltwater Pulse 1b began, the Earth was already fragile. The first catastrophic release of glacial lake gases had destabilized the climate. The ice sheets were fractured. The jet streams were changing direction. The world was warming faster than life could adapt. But most humans were still living in coastal regions, because coasts are always the richest places to live. They had no reason to believe the oceans would rise further. They had no idea this was only the beginning. Because beneath the remaining ice sheets, something even larger than lake gases was forming. Another lake. A deeper one. One held back not by a single ice wall, but by an entire collapsing ice continent. Earth begins to heat from below. Until recently, scientists believed the end of the Ice Age was caused only by greenhouse gases and orbital warming cycles. But new evidence shows something else was happening under the ice. Geothermal energy. Large portions of the ice sheets covering North America and Antarctica were not sitting on frozen rock, they were sitting on volcanic systems. As the ice thinned, the Earth heated faster. Heat that had been trapped for tens of thousands of years began to rise. Temperatures under the ice climbed. Water began melting not just from the top, but from the bottom. Imagine a glacier the size of a continent floating on a river. That was the late Pleistocene. And one day, that river broke loose. The second ice dam collapse. Around 11,500 to 11,300 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive slab covering most of Canada, reached a point of no return. A second glacial lake, even larger than Agassiz, ruptured. Not all at once, but in stages. The collapse happened in waves. Each wave raised sea levels. Each pulse erased land. Each surge destroyed life. And the final stage, the last release of meltwater, was the moment that pushed the oceans into their modern shape. The day the ancient world was drowned. Map how much land was lost? To understand the massive scale of the flood, we need to imagine the world as it existed before the oceans rose. White heavy checkmark the Mediterranean was not fully connected. White heavy checkmark the Persian Gulf was a lush river valley, not a sea. White heavy checkmark the English Channel was a walkable land bridge, not water. White heavy checkmark Japan was connected to mainland Asia. White heavy checkmark the Indonesian islands were one single massive continent called Sunderland. White heavy checkmark Australia and New Guinea were one giant landmass called Seoul. White heavy checkmark India was connected to Sri Lanka by land. White heavy checkmark the Bahamas were not islands, they were plateau highlands above the sea. White heavy checkmark Cuba was twice its current size. White heavy checkmark the coast of China stretched 60 miles further east. The coast of North Africa extended hundreds of miles outward into land now underwater. Most of human activity, hunting, shelter building, early trade, migrations, happened along these ancient coastlines. And when the flood came, those civilizations, those people, those memories, went under. Chart with downward trend the scientific proof of sudden sea rise. There are three major lines of evidence that prove sea levels did not rise slowly, but catastrophically. 1. Drowned river systems. Across the world, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Red Sea, scientists have found ancient river deltas far below modern sea level. These rivers once flowed above ground, meaning entire landscapes are now submerged. 2. Marine fossils on inland cliffs. Evidence shows ocean species suddenly appearing in places where water should not have reached unless the rise was rapid and violent. 3. Global coral reef death zones. Coral cannot grow when sea levels rise faster than 1 centimeter per year, yet we find entire coral ecosystems that died in the same century, buried under 10 to 30 meters of rising water. Something happened too fast for life to adapt. That was the second flood. Spiral shell the 400-foot mark. When sea levels stabilized thousands of years later, the world had lost. White heavy checkmark 27% of its land surface. White heavy checkmark over 10 million square miles of habitable coastline. White heavy checkmark countless human settlements, animal ranges, and ecosystems. This number, the 400-foot ocean rise, is not speculation. It is measured. It is real. And it happened in the span of a few thousand years, with the fastest part happening in centuries, not millennia. If we had lived then, we would have seen the ocean rise every year. Not geologically. Visibly. Measurably. Coastlines moved. Islands vanished. Hills became islands. Valleys became seas. The world map of the Ice Age would be unrecognizable today. Which means one thing. All ancient civilizations that lived before the flood lived on land that no longer exists. Their artifacts are underwater. Their burial sites are underwater. Their cities are underwater. Their history is underwater. And for thousands of years, we've been digging in the wrong place. Globe with meridians, the global consequences. Once the oceans rose, the world did not return to balance. Instead, it entered a new phase. White heavy checkmark forests replaced tundra. White heavy checkmark ocean systems stabilized. White heavy checkmark human populations relocated inland and upward. White heavy checkmark megafauna extinctions accelerated. White heavy checkmark weather patterns changed permanently. White heavy checkmark global temperatures locked into Holocene stability, the climate of recorded human civilization. With the flood complete, the Earth entered a new age. The age we still live in. But there's a mystery. Shortly after the flood, something else appears suddenly in the archaeological record. Human civilization. Not scattered tribes. Not nomadic hunters. Cities. Cities with architecture. Cities with agriculture. Cities with knowledge. It is almost as if something, or someone, restarted civilization after the cataclysm. As if the survivors remembered what was lost. And rebuilt. But not in the same places. Higher. Safer. Inland. If the ancient world truly experienced a catastrophic flood 12,000 years ago, then surely someone must have seen it coming. The question is not whether there were warnings, but who heard them, and why the world ignored them. Because throughout history, buried within myth, scripture, and even ancient astronomy, there are traces of a countdown, a global alarm that humanity either misunderstood or refused to believe. And perhaps the most haunting part is this? Almost every ancient civilization preserved a memory of a great warning, and every warning was dismissed. The world before the deluge, a civilization that never expected to fall. What did life look like just before the flood? Archaeologists now believe the Earth around 12,000 years ago was not a primitive wasteland of cavemen, but a thriving world that understood astronomy, agriculture, engineering, and possibly even energy technology. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang, and the submerged ruins off the coast of India suggest that ancient humanity had culture, organization, religion, and knowledge. But with knowledge came arrogance. The skies had been stable for thousands of years. The climate was warm and predictable. Food systems were flourishing. Populations were growing. So when the warnings came, whether from prophets, astronomers, or ancient scientists, they sounded like superstition, not science. Sound familiar? The first warnings, the stars became the messengers. Many ancient myths describe gods warning mankind of an approaching disaster. But what if those gods were astronomers, using the only written language they had, symbolic storytelling, to tell the world? Something is coming from the sky. In ancient Mesopotamia, the god Enki warns the hero Ziusudra of an approaching flood. In India, Vishnu warns Mana to build a boat before the waters rise. In Aztec tradition, the god Tezcatlipoca warns the humans that the world will be destroyed by water. In Greek myth, Prometheus warns his son Deucalion to prepare for a cataclysm. Different continents. Different languages. Same message. But all these stories share another strange detail. The warning came before the catastrophe, but most of the world refused to act. The priests, the scientists, and the sky signs. Today, people separate religion from science, but in the ancient world, they were the same thing. Those who studied the stars were the priests, the calendar keepers, the mathematicians. When they saw the sky behaving strangely, they didn't write scientific journals, they told stories. What did they see? A change in the tilt of the Earth. A cluster of approaching comet fragments. A series of strange red streaks in the sky. A temperature shift too strong to be natural. Animals migrating out of season. Ice sheets cracking in the far north. The most powerful were not the rulers, but the watchers, those whose duty was to observe the heavens. And in the final centuries before the flood, something terrified them. The warning nobody listened to, the final generation before impact. Many ancient flood legends describe a world that became corrupt before the disaster. But corruption in ancient texts didn't just mean evil behavior. It also meant the rejection of wisdom and the rise of arrogance. Civilizations before the flood began. Abandoning the old way of life. Mocking the elders. Living for pleasure and luxury. Ignoring nature's balance. Treating the world as indestructible. In the Book of Enoch, the people laughed at the fool who said the skies would fall. In Greek lore, mankind became drunk with power and believed the gods could not touch them. In Hindu scriptures, the age before the flood was marked by material obsession and spiritual blindness. If this sounds familiar, it should. Because every time a civilization reaches its peak, it believes it has outgrown consequences. The Pre-Flood Global Network, why the warning spread worldwide. You may wonder, if the world was so advanced, why didn't every nation prepare? The answer is chilling, because some did. Evidence suggests. White heavy check mark some groups began relocating to higher ground. White heavy check mark others stored seeds, tools, metals, and written knowledge. White heavy check mark some built underground vaults and mountain temples. White heavy check mark some prepared boats, arks, and floating structures. But only few believed. And fewer still survived. The ones who lived became the ancestors of the new world, the farmers, the builders, the storytellers, the ones who rebuilt human civilization after the waters receded. This explains why almost every culture contains the same line. We were warned, but the world did not listen. The final sign, when the sky turned to fire. Almost every ancient culture describes a fiery omen in the heavens just before the flood. In some stories, it is a god with a flaming sword. In others, a star that split apart. In others, a burning dragon crossing the sky. To our ancestors, this was myth. To us, it sounds like a comet or asteroid breaking into fragments, the same fragments believed to have struck Earth around 12,800 years ago, melting ice sheets and triggering global flooding. Ancient astronomers may not have known what it was, but they knew what it meant. They recorded the last peaceful sunrise before disaster. Then came the fire. Then came the quake. Then came the ocean. The world that did listen, the guardians of survival. Those who took the warnings seriously are described in myths as the people of the mountain, the preservers of knowledge, the builders of the ark, the chosen ones, the watchers who prepared. These were not chosen by fate, they were chosen by awareness. And so the real tragedy is not the flood, but the fact that the majority of the world could have survived, but didn't. The lesson of the lost world. The question is not just what caused the flood, but what caused humanity to ignore the signs. Because if this cycle is real, if Earth really experiences cataclysmic resets, then the greatest warning left behind in ancient flood myths is this. Civilization always thinks it is too advanced to fall. But the Earth does not care what we believe. If the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago was not just a slow rise of seas, but the result of a single catastrophic event, something sudden, violent, and world-altering, then we must confront the possibility that Earth did not drown by accident, but by impact. This is the theory that has shaken both archaeology and geology in the past 2 decades. That sometime around 12,800 years ago, at the exact moment human history seems to reset, something from space hit Earth, or rather, many things did. And everything, the fires, the darkness, the melting ice, the rising seas, began in a single moment. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the theory mainstream science tried to bury. In 2007, a group of researchers, including geologists, astronomers, and archaeologists, released a paper claiming that a massive cosmic impact, likely a fragmented comet, struck Earth near the end of the last ice age. The evidence, they said, was found across 4 continents. The impact triggered global wildfires, sudden climate freezing, megafauna extinction, the collapse of pre-flood civilizations, a rapid sea level rise that drowned coastlines. The event is known as the Younger Dryas impact. But why did the scientific world react with hostility instead of interest? Because if true, the theory rewrites human history. It suggests crossmark civilization did not slowly begin 6,000 years ago, it fell, then restarted. Crossmark flood myths are not just symbolic, they are historical memory. Crossmark the Earth is not stable, it can reset life in an instant. Crossmark ancient humans were not primitive, they were survivors of catastrophe. In short, everything we were taught about early history becomes incomplete. The evidence buried in the Earth, materials that shouldn't exist. The Younger Dryas impact theory is not based on myth, but on hard physical evidence. White-Heavy Mark 1. Nanodiamonds. Microscopic diamonds found in a thin layer of soil dating to 12,800 years ago, formed only during cosmic explosions or impacts. White-Heavy Mark 2. Melt glass. Sand and rock fused into glass by temperatures hotter than volcanoes, the kind created when a meteor strikes at thousands of degrees. White-Heavy Mark 3. Shocked quartz. A crystal structure only produced under extreme pressure, like a nuclear blast or an asteroid strike. White-Heavy Mark 4. High platinum levels. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but common in comets and meteorites. The 12,800-year layer contains platinum spikes 1000x normal levels. White-Heavy Mark 5. Massive wildfire layer. A black, burned earth layer, found worldwide, showing that 10% of the planet's surface caught fire at once, something no volcano could cause. Every one of these markers is found precisely in the same global soil layer, a geological tombstone. Something happened. Something violent. Something that doesn't happen naturally on Earth. The missing crater problem, and the discovery that changed everything. For years critics asked, where is the crater? But that argument failed once scientists realized White heavy checkmark: the impactor was likely a comet, not a dense asteroid. White heavy checkmark: it may have broken up in the atmosphere into multiple fragments. White heavy checkmark: the impact likely struck ice sheets, not exposed land. White heavy checkmark: melting ice would erase or bury the craters beneath oceans. Then in 2018, the impossible happened. A crater was discovered under a mile of ice in Greenland, 19 miles wide, dating to the exact right period. Suddenly, the theory wasn't fringe anymore. Suddenly, the flood had a trigger. The world burns, and then it freezes. When a large object hits Earth at high velocity, the first effect is fire, but the second is ice. The impact would have. Fire turned forests into ash within hours. Fog filled the atmosphere with black soot. Sun with rays blocked sunlight and ended photosynthesis. Snowflake triggered a sudden 1,300-year mini-ice age. And when the ice sheets rapidly melted from the heat shock, billions of gallons of water rushed into the oceans, raising sea levels over 400 feet. The flood wasn't slow. It was violent. It was not rain for 40 days. It was glacier collapsing into the sea like continents breaking apart. The Carolina Bays, the crater field no one talked about. Across the eastern United States are thousands of oval depressions called Carolina Bays, all pointing in the same direction, as if something rained down from the sky. For decades scientists had no explanation. Now there is one. These are believed to be secondary impact scars, the result of ice chunks blasted from the main impact crater in Greenland and landing across North America. A cosmic shotgun. If true, then the sky did not deliver one blow, but many. The extinction event: why entire species vanished overnight. Before the flood, Earth was filled with megafauna. Mammoths. Giant ground sloths. Saber-toothed cats. Short-faced bears. Mastodons. American lions. Within a few generations, gone. Not slowly. Not over thousands of years. They died instantly. Some mammoths were found in Siberia frozen standing up, with fresh flowers still in their mouths, as if death came in a single second. That is not evolution. That is trauma. The destruction of pre-flood civilization, history's greatest reset. People often assume the flood destroyed primitive humans, but what if it destroyed something more advanced? Sites like Göbekli Tepe, which appear fully formed, not invented slowly, may not be the beginning of civilization. But its restart point, built by the survivors of a much older world. What historians call the beginning of history may be nothing more than the beginning of recovery. Humanity didn't start at zero. Humanity was knocked back to zero. And the survivors left warnings carved in stone, in myth, in prophecy, telling the future world. It will happen again. Because the ancient world didn't believe the watchers. And neither does ours. If the flood 12,000 years ago truly reshaped the planet, there should be one type of evidence we can still see today: ruins beneath the ocean. And not just scattered fragments, but entire coastlines, cities, and civilizations that vanished when sea levels rose more than 400 feet. Because before the flood, the world map was not the world we know today. The continents were the same, but the coastlines were not. Millions of square miles of land now underwater were once fertile plains, river valleys, ports, and kingdoms. The ocean is not just a body of water. It is a graveyard of history. The world before the flood, a different coastline, a different civilization. During the Ice Age, massive glacier held so much water in frozen form that sea levels were over 120 meters, 400 feet, lower. This wasn't a minor difference, it was a second world. Land that is now ocean floor once held. Cities. Trade routes. Farms. Ports. Temples. Populations. Cultures now erased from the surface of the Earth. When the Younger Dryas impact melted the glacier and ocean levels surged, the world's coastlines were redrawn in a geological blink. This means one thing. Fire: if there was a global civilization before the flood, most of it is underwater. And now, we are beginning to find pieces of it. the sunken ruins that shouldn't exist, and why they change everything. Indian 1. The lost city of Dwarka, India. Off the coast of Gujarat lies a 7-square-mile underwater city with roads, walls, pillars, and what appears to be a port. Indian tradition claims Dwarka was destroyed by a massive flood. Scientists now date some artifacts there to 9,500 to 12,000 years old, the exact era of the global flood. Japanese 2. Yonaguni Monument, Japan. A colossal stone structure lies beneath the sea near Okinawa. Terraces, platforms, staircases, and geometric angles that do not occur naturally. Mainstream archaeologists call it natural. Divers who study it laugh at that explanation. The structure appears intentionally carved, and it lies 100 foot underwater, meaning it was built before the flood swallowed it. Egyptian 3. Egypt's sunken cities, Heracleion and Canopus. Before Alexandria, there was Heracleion, a great trading port mentioned by ancient historians. In 2000, it was found completely underwater, with statues, temples, sphinxes, ships, and entire neighborhoods perfectly preserved in the seabed. The city did not sink slowly, it was destroyed suddenly, likely by a massive surge of water. Cuban 4. The mega ruins of Cuba, 2,300 feet below sea level. In 2001, sonar scanning off the coast of Cuba revealed geometric structures the size of pyramids, laid out in grid formation, far deeper than any known flood level. If real, this would mean one terrifying thing. Some cities were not just flooded, they were crushed under tectonic collapse during the disaster. The site was quietly buried in academic silence. Greek 5. Pavlopetri, the oldest underwater city in Europe. In Greece lies a planned stone city dated to 5,000 to 6,000 years old, but divers discovered the foundations extend deeper into older layers, suggesting humans lived there before the sea claimed it. Scattered across the Mediterranean are dozens of submerged sites that were dry land before the flood. And these are only the ones we found. The ancient maps that should not exist, but do. If most of the ancient world is underwater, why do some ancient maps show coastlines that only satellites and modern bathymetry can confirm? Enter the Piri Reis map, 1513, the Orontius Phineas map, 1531, and others that show white heavy checkmark Antarctica without ice. White heavy checkmark coastlines that were above water over 10,000 years ago. White heavy checkmark accurate longitudes that shouldn't have been possible before clocks. These maps were not created from imagination, they were copied from older, pre-flood sources. And if ancient people mapped the world before it sank, then ancient people had ships before the flood. They had navigation. They had trade. They had knowledge far beyond the caveman narrative. The antediluvian world, a global civilization before history began. What if Atlantis wasn't just one place, but one era? A time when globe showing Europe, Africa, humanity lived mostly along coastlines. Sailboat global navigation already existed. Classical building cities and temples stood where waves now roll. Scroll science, myth, and religion were still unified. That world may not have been science fiction advanced. But it was not primitive. And the proof lies not just underwater, but in the myths of every surviving culture. There was a time when the world was ruled by great kingdoms. Then came the flood, and only a few survived. We rebuilt from the mountains, not the shores. Different words. Same memory. The greatest loss in human history, not people, but knowledge. When the waters rose and swallowed the world's coastal civilizations, Earth didn't just lose cities. It lost writing systems, inventions, histories, maps, libraries, engineering, mathematics, medicine, records of who we were before the flood. The survivors, scattered, traumatized, and reduced to small populations, did not restart civilization. They recovered from it. This is why the earliest post-flood cultures appear to suddenly know things they should not know. Small blue diamond, how to build megaliths. Small blue diamond, how to track the stars. Small blue diamond, how to create advanced calendars. Small blue diamond, how to align sacred sites to solstices. Small blue diamond, how to quarry, transport, and carve stone no primitive tribe could move. They were not inventing new knowledge. They were remembering fragments of an older world. The mystery of the survivors, the mountain builders. After the flood, civilizations did not build along the coast. They built high places. Mountain Machu Picchu. Mountain Göbekli Tepe. Mountain Sacsayhuaman. Mountain Petra. Mountain Tiwanaku. Mountain the Andes, the Himalayas, the Caucasus. The survivors of the flood were not ignorant. They were cautious. They built where water could not reach them again. And they left warnings in stone, warnings modern humanity has ignored. The modern problem, why we aren't looking for the real lost world. The ocean covers 70% of the Earth, but humans have explored less than 5% of it. And the part we have explored? Almost no archaeological research. Almost no funding. Almost no media coverage. Why? Because finding a 10,000-year-old underwater city forces us to rewrite history, religion, science, anthropology, and education all at once. It means crossmark the timeline of human civilization is wrong. Crossmark the flood myths are based on memory, not imagination. Crossmark technology and knowledge existed before recorded history. Crossmark we are not the first advanced civilization, just the latest. And that is a truth the world is not ready for. When the waters finally stopped rising, the world was not the same place. The coastlines were gone. The great cities were gone. The knowledge centers, ports, temples, libraries, trade hubs, and kingdoms of the old world were drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. Humanity did not emerge victorious from the flood, it emerged broken, scattered, and reduced to small pockets of survivors living on high ground. And yet, something miraculous happened. Instead of falling back into total chaos and animal existence, civilization restarted. Not slowly, not randomly, but with purpose. Agriculture reappeared. Monument building reappeared. Astronomy reappeared. Mathematics reappeared. Religious structure reappeared. Stone architecture reappeared. Not over tens of thousands of years, but within a few generations. This is one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology. If humanity was truly primitive before the flood, then after a global catastrophe it should have taken 50,000 years to rebuild, not 500. Something, or someone, helped restart the world. And almost every ancient culture names the same kind of being. A teacher. A civilizer. A bringer of knowledge. A survivor of the old world. The flood survivors who became gods, the great teachers of the new earth. Different cultures, different continents, but the same story. A mysterious figure arrives after the flood, wise, tall, radiant, knowledgeable, and begins teaching the scattered survivors how to rebuild. In every single case. White heavy checkmark they arrive from outside the newly formed tribal world. White heavy checkmark they possess advanced knowledge no one else has. White heavy checkmark they are described as godlike, not because of magic, but wisdom. White heavy checkmark they teach writing, counting, farming, building, healing, astronomy. White heavy checkmark they appear abruptly in the earliest post-flood layers of time. These beings were not gods. They were the last survivors of a world that no longer existed. They were the ones who prepared, the watchers, the warners, the ark builders, the mountaintop preservers of knowledge. The seven sages, the same story on different continents. One of the most repeated patterns across civilizations is the memory of seven sages, often depicted as seven wise men who travel the world after the flood, carrying the lost knowledge of the previous age. In Sumer, they are the Apkallu. India, they are the Saptarishi. Greece, the seven sages of antiquity. Polynesia, the seven brothers from the sky. Egypt, the seven shining ones. They are always white heavy checkmark connected with astronomy. White heavy checkmark connected with divine knowledge. White heavy checkmark linked to inheritance from a lost age. White heavy checkmark described as non-local, not born among the new tribes. White heavy checkmark revered, not worshipped, because they were remembered, not invented. They were not inventors, they were preservers. The world doesn't start over, it gets restarted. If humans truly faced extinction after the flood, why didn't the world fall into total ignorance? Why does Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years old, appear fully formed, as if designed by practiced architects? Why does agriculture suddenly show up in multiple places simultaneously? Why do the earliest post-flood societies, White heavy checkmark, build megaliths that require advanced engineering? White heavy checkmark, know star alignments and solstice tracking? White heavy checkmark, possess mythology referring to a world that no longer exists? White heavy checkmark, behave as if rebuilding, not inventing? Because they were not discovering civilization, they were restoring fragments of the one that died. The DNA mystery, why civilization starts with the same genetic clusters. Genetic studies show that after the Younger Dryas flood, the global population was bottlenecked, meaning small blue diamond, almost all humans alive today descend from a very small group of survivors. Small blue diamond, the population may have dropped from millions to as little as tens of thousands. Small blue diamond civilization re-emerged in mountain regions, not coastal ones. The oldest post-flood civilizations began in the same type of places. Mount in the Fertile Crescent Highlands. Mount in the Andean Mountains. Mount in the Caucasus region. Mount in the Anatolian Plateau. Mount in the Tibetan Plateau. These were not random settlements, they were refuge zones. High ground equals survival. The sudden miracle of writing, a memory that should not exist. Writing does not develop overnight, unless it already existed before the flood. But that is exactly what the archaeological record shows. In Sumer, writing appears already functional around 3300 BCE. Not slowly scribbled. Not experimental. Fully structured. How? Because the survivors didn't invent writing, they reintroduced it. Same with white heavy checkmark agriculture. White heavy checkmark calendar systems. White heavy checkmark megalith construction. White heavy checkmark mythology with global flood consistency. White heavy checkmark stone cutting precision seen in the Andes, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon. A primitive world does not suddenly build a 1,000-ton stone wall with perfect joins. A remembering world does. The gods who were men, but remembered as more than human. The civilizers of the ancient world wore robes, not skins. They spoke unknown languages. They knew the stars. They taught, healed, measured, built, organized. To the traumatized survivors of a drowned world, they looked like gods. But the real power they had was knowledge. Knowledge from a world that had ended. The teachings they left behind, not religion, but warning. If you look at the oldest myths of the post-flood world, they all contain three messages. A great flood destroyed the former world. It happened because mankind ignored the warnings. It will happen again if we forget the past. And what did we do? We turned the warnings into religion. We turned the teachers into deities. We turned the history into mythology. We preserved the legend and lost the lesson. They say history is written by the survivors. But what happens when the survivors of a global cataclysm are scattered, traumatized, and left with fragments of memory instead of language, technology, or nationhood? If the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago truly wiped out the dominant civilization of its era, as the evidence explored in the previous part strongly suggests, then the next logical question becomes, who survived? How did they rebuild? And why do traces of the same symbols, gods, and knowledge appear in every ancient culture on Earth, despite thousands of miles of separation? The Age of Aftermath, a planet in ruins. Geologists refer to the post-flood era as the Younger Dryas termination, a sudden warming event that followed the extinction flood. But ancient texts tell the story differently. They describe a world where the sun was dimmed, where ash and mud covered entire regions, where the ocean swallowed coastlines so completely that even the mountains drowned. The survivors lived in caves and highlands, islands or mountaintops that were once valleys, regions with access to fresh water and game, shorelines that no longer exist today. They were not merely starting over, they were starting at zero. Civilization didn't slowly evolve from caves to cities. It recovered. And the archaeological record supports that. The rebuilders, strange knowledge in primitive times. Around 9600 BC, only a few centuries after the flood, suddenly and inexplicably, massive stone architecture appears across the planet. What makes this explosive leap strange? There are no developmental stages. One day humans are hunter-gatherers. The next day they are constructing mathematically aligned stone temples weighing 20 tons. Survivors of catastrophe don't invent knowledge. They remember it. Ancient legends of the ones who came after. Nearly every ancient culture speaks of civilization bringers, the ones who arrived after the flood to teach agriculture, astronomy, language, and law. Civilization. Name of the teacher. Description. Sumerians. Oans. Half man, half fish, came from the sea with knowledge of writing and math. Egyptians. Thoth. God of wisdom, writing, architecture, restored order after the flood. Mesoamericans. Quetzalcoatl. Feathered serpent, brought calendars, astronomy, agriculture. Greeks. Prometheus. Brought knowledge after destruction by water and fire. Hindus. Manu. Saved from the flood by a god, repopulated earth, preserved knowledge. Different names. Same pattern. No culture claims to have invented civilization, only to have received it. So who were these civilizers? Were they survivors of a high-tech world? Descendants of Atlantis? Refugees of a drowned global empire? Or something even older? The first cities, evidence of advanced memory. As the waters receded and global temperatures stabilized, isolated pockets of humans gathered around fertile zones, rivers, lakes, and deltas that had not existed before the flood. The oldest cities on Earth, all appearing suddenly and fully planned, share three traits. Massive stone construction. Sacred geometry or astronomy embedded in layout. Creation myths about a flood and lost age. Examples. Çatalhöyük, Turkey, 9000 plus years old, no streets, identical housing blocks like designed urban planning. Eridu, Iraq, the Sumerians called it the first city, built by gods after the flood. Varanasi, India, said to have existed before the flood and restored afterward. These cities appear too early, too sudden, too advanced. It is as if people remembered cities, not invented them. Why did survivors spread knowledge in secret symbols? One of the strangest outcomes of the flood is that knowledge seems encoded, not openly recorded. Symbols appear worldwide in post-flood cultures. The spiral. The all-seeing eye. The serpent. The sun disk. The sacred tree. The floodboat. The seven sages. These symbols appear in Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, and Oceania, long before contact was possible. Either one shared civilization existed before the flood, or knowledge was carried and seeded with intention. Some researchers argue that survivors were not just saving knowledge. They were hiding it until humanity was ready again. The shock of lost technology. One of the great mysteries historians avoid. Why did humans forget how to build megalithic structures? If we learned architecture from scratch, why was the best stonework done first? Why did precision architecture decline instead of evolve? Göbekli Tepe Pyramid, Stonehenge, medieval castles, modern concrete. The path of architecture is backwards. That only makes sense if white heavy checkmark the most advanced knowledge existed before the flood. White heavy checkmark survivors used a reduced version of ancient techniques. Over generations, the knowledge eroded. Flood survivors didn't get dumber. They got fewer. Knowledge was lost because teachers died before they could teach enough people. The children of memory, who inherited the old world secrets. As centuries passed, the descendants of the survivors split into 3 groups. Group. Role. Example. Preservers. Priests, builders, astronomers who guarded sacred knowledge. Egyptian priesthood, Sumerian scribes, Mayan sky watchers. Migrants. Tribes who kept oral history but lost the science behind it. Aboriginals, Native Americans, Dogon, Polynesians. Forgetting civilizations. Societies that retained flood myths but not meaning. Norse, Celtic, Slavic, Hebrew. The preservers built monuments. The migrants kept the stories. The forgetters kept fragments of memory. Together, they form the global puzzle of post-flood humanity. The return of the oceans, why coastlines matter. If most advanced cities before the flood were coastal, then they are now underwater. Today, over 30 major ancient ruins sit beneath the sea. Sunken site. Location. Estimated age. Yonaguni Monument. Japan. 10,000 to 12,000 years. Doggerland. North Sea. 8,000 to 10,000 years. Dwarka. India. 9,000 plus years. Bimini Road. Bahamas. Unknown, but megalithic. Cuba mega ruins. Caribbean. Possibly 50,000 years old. When the seas rose 400 feet, the world map was erased, and so was its history. Most of civilization's missing chapter is not missing. It is underwater. And the survivors knew it. The flood didn't end the story, it hid it. We are not looking at the timeline of human evolution. We are looking at the recovery period after global erasure. What mainstream history calls the beginning may only be the restart. Civilizations did not rise randomly after the Great Flood. They rose around knowledge. And knowledge, in every ancient culture, was controlled by the same kind of people. The priests. The astronomers. The keepers of sacred texts. The builders of stone temples. The interpreters of the gods. But what if these priests weren't just religious figures? What if they were the last educated survivors of a lost world, guardians of memory, not mythology? After the flood, knowledge wasn't lost. It was restricted. The shared blueprint across all civilizations. How do completely separate ancient cultures, Sumer, Egypt, Maya, Indus, Olmec, Dogon, Aboriginal Australia, end up with the same ideas? The world destroyed by a flood. The survivors taught by God's war sages. The use of sacred geometry. A calendar based on the stars. A god associated with the serpent or dragon. A skyfallen teacher who brought laws, writing, agriculture. A prophecy of a future return. Either they all made up the same story, or they inherited it. And the fact that the same star constellations, numerical systems, and cosmology models appear worldwide suggests that knowledge did not evolve separately. It spread from a single source. A pre-flood global civilization. The role of the priesthood after the flood. When the world collapsed, knowledge did not belong to the masses. It belonged to a few. Civilization. Priest class name. What they guarded. Egypt. Priests of Thoth. Astronomy, sacred math, medicine, burial rites. Sumer. Apkallu scribes. Writing, kingship law, flood records. Maya. Ajkn, timekeepers. Calendar cycles, cosmic prophecy. India. Brahmins. Vedas, flood memory, star maps. Greece. Orphic and Eleusinian priests. Secrets of rebirth and destruction cycles. Babylon. Magi. Astrology, omens, divine timing. They did not spread knowledge freely. They preserved it through symbols, rituals, oral codes, and restricted teaching. The average person was not meant to know. Only initiates were taught the truth. This is why almost every ancient temple school required initiation, oaths, secrecy, ritual purification, hidden chambers. Because they weren't just guarding spiritual beliefs. They were guarding history. Myth as disguised history. Modern historians treat ancient myths as storytelling. But what if myth wasn't fiction, but encryption? A method to survive censorship, invasion, and decay? Because after the flood, there was no paper. No libraries. No printing. No national language. So knowledge had to be encoded in symbols and stories. That means the serpent wasn't a snake, it was a symbol for ancient wisdom. The gods from the sky weren't fictional, they were real people remembered as divine. The tree of life was not a plant, but a map of cosmology. The ark was not only a boat, it was the preservation of gene pools and knowledge. Myth wasn't superstition. Myth was memory disguised as religion. The secret they guarded: the world works in cycles. The priesthoods of ancient civilizations shared one central doctrine. The world is destroyed in repeating cycles. Not once. Not by accident. But repeatedly, in measurable cosmic intervals. They believed history follows a pattern. Cycle name. Type of destruction. Source. Hindu Yuga cycle. Flood, fire, reset. Vedas. Maya long count. End of world age. Maya codices. Egyptian Zep Tepi. Time before last cataclysm. Temple inscriptions. Greek great year. Cosmic cycle causing destruction. Plato. Hopi 4 worlds. 3 destroyed, the 4th now. Oral tradition. Hebrew pre-Adamic earth. World destroyed before Genesis. Hidden doctrine. Every culture says the same thing. The world has ended before, and it will end again. The flood was not a one-time tragedy. It was one turn of the cycle. And the knowledge of when the next turn will come was held only by the initiated. The gatekeepers of time. Why were ancient priest classes obsessed with astronomy, solstices and equinoxes, precession of the equinoxes, aligning temples with stars, stone calendars, number cycles like 360, 144, 432, 2160, 12,000? Because the sky was the clock of destruction. The survivors knew the flood was triggered by cosmic forces. So the only way to prevent humanity from forgetting was to encode astronomy into religion. Meaning, you think you're praying? You're actually repeating encoded math. You think you're honoring a god? You're actually preserving a lost science. You think temples were spiritual monuments? They were star clocks. Religion was not born out of ignorance. It was the last storage system for advanced knowledge. The dangerous knowledge, what they did not teach. Only the top initiates received the inner doctrine. White have a checkmark that humans once lived in a higher age. White have a checkmark that a worldwide civilization existed before the flood. White have a checkmark that the flood was caused by an astronomical event. White have a checkmark that it will happen again. This knowledge was not for the public. It was controlled for 2 reasons. 1. Survival of hierarchy. Knowledge equals power. Religion equals control. 2. Fear of repeating the past. If civilization's fall was caused by human arrogance, then revealing the past might bring the same fate. So they taught symbol, not science. They gave the masses ritual, not reason. They replaced history with myth. But the blueprint was always there, hidden in plain sight. Who broke the seal? As centuries passed, empires rose and fell. But something changed around 500 BC, 100 AD. Knowledge that was once hidden began surfacing. Pythagoras learned Egyptian priest math. Plato revealed Atlantis and the flood cycles. Hebrew Apocrypha discussed pre-flood civilizations. The Mayans openly recorded destruction cycles. Indian texts began naming cosmic causes for floods. The priests could not stop one force. Writing. Once knowledge left the temple, its secrecy was doomed. The age of kings with secrets was ending. The age of people with books was beginning. But then, a new kind of power seized control of history. History is not just a record of what happened. It is a record of what was allowed to survive. For over 10,000 years after the Great Flood, knowledge was preserved through symbols, temples, priesthoods, oral codes, and astronomical markers. But around 2000 to 2500 years ago, a new kind of event began. Not a natural catastrophe, but an intentional erasure. A war not against people, but against memory. Part 10 exposes the systematic destruction of ancient knowledge. Who did it, why they did it, and how the world was rewritten. The first target, the libraries of the ancients. Civilization did not begin in Greece or Rome. Those cultures inherited far older knowledge. The Greeks themselves admit this. We Greeks are children compared to the Egyptians. Solon, as quoted by Plato. So how did Western history become the official timeline of civilization? Because almost every older archive was burned, buried, or banned. Destroyed library. Destroyed by. What was lost? Library of Alexandria. Multiple waves, including Rome and early church. 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls from Egypt, Greece, Persia, and lost pre-flood sources. Library of Pergamon. Rome. 200,000 plus texts, many on ancient astronomy. Mayan codices. Spanish conquest. 95% of all written Maya history. Nalanda Library, India. Invaders. 9 million manuscripts, including ancient flood astronomy. Serapeum archives. Christian mobs. Records of pre-dynastic Egypt and cosmic cycles. Each burning wasn't a mistake. It was policy. Knowledge was not destroyed because it was wrong. It was destroyed because it was too right. Why was ancient history erased? There were 3 reasons, and they form the core of the conspiracy. White heavy checkmark reason number 1, control of origin. If humans had a forgotten advanced past, then kings, empires, and religions could not claim to be the first. To control a people, you must control what they think they came from, what they think is possible, what they fear will happen again. If people remembered that civilization had risen and fallen before, they would stop worshipping kings and gods and start preparing for the next cycle. White heavy checkmark reason number 2, control of time. Ancient civilizations track time in 26,000-year cosmic cycles. Empires replaced this with linear time. History begins with us. That destroys the concept of past global catastrophe and hides the threat of future catastrophe. If the past was erased, the future no longer seems predictable. White heavy checkmark reason number 3, control of God. Every ancient culture believed the gods were once humans, elevated survivors of a fallen world. But empires needed religion to be absolute, not historical. So the old gods became pagan. The old texts became heresy. The old symbols became demonic. And the priests of memory were replaced by priests of obedience. The empire that rewrote the world, Rome. Rome did not just conquer lands. Rome conquered timelines. When Julius Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria, he was not just destroying Egypt. He was erasing everything before Rome. Later, Constantine and the early church took it further. Action. Result. Declared old texts false history. Replaced flood science with theology. Ordered destruction of pagan temples. Erased astronomical knowledge. Made literacy illegal for commoners. Centralized knowledge into priest class. Replaced cyclical time with biblical time. Hid pre-flood civilizations. Declared forbidden books heresy. Drove ancient records underground. You cannot control the future. If people know the past. The Dark Age was not ignorance, it was enforced forgetting. From 400 AD to 1400 AD, Europe lived in a 1,000-year period where astronomy was banned. Pre-Christian history was illegal. Books were chained, locked, and burned. Only priests and royalty could read. Myths were rewritten as allegory. The flood became a religious story, not a real event. But while Europe forgot, other civilizations did not. White heavy checkmark India still preserved flood texts in Sanskrit. White heavy checkmark Tibet hid records in monasteries. White heavy checkmark the Mayans preserved cosmic calendars. White heavy checkmark Aboriginal Australians kept 60,000 plus years of oral history. White heavy checkmark West African Dogon preserved star maps older than writing. The truth did not die. It went underground. The reappearing evidence, why history is collapsing now. From the 1800s onward, three things changed. Archaeology began validating ancient myths. Geology proved massive flooding events. Ice core records confirmed Younger Dryas catastrophe. But even then, the system fought back. Smithsonian lost giant skeletons and pre-flood artifacts. Universities refused to carbon date megaliths older than 6,000 years. Museums locked anomalous objects in private vaults. Historians labeled all pre-flood claims as pseudoscience. You are not allowed to rewrite history, even if the evidence is older than history itself. But now, something is happening that no empire can stop. The flood truth is resurfacing worldwide at the same time. Why? Because the past is no longer being discovered. It is being uncovered. Beneath ice. Beneath ocean floors. Beneath forbidden ruins. Beneath religions. Beneath myths. Humanity is remembering. And that leads us to the most important question of all. Every civilization that survived the Great Flood of 12,000 years ago left the same final message. It will happen again. They were not speaking in metaphor or religion. They were speaking in memory. The flood was not a myth. It was not a moral story. It was a recorded event, triggered by forces bigger than humanity, written into stone, scripture, sky, and architecture. And what the ancient world tried desperately to preserve was not just the story of the past, but the pattern of the future. Part 11 brings every thread together. The scientific, the historical, the mythological, the astronomical, the prophetic. Because the question is no longer, what caused the flood 12,000 years ago? But, are we now approaching the next cycle? The ancient clock, time is not linear, it is cyclical. Every ancient culture operated on the belief that Earth moves through repeating ages. The Maya called them suns. The Hindus called them yugas. The Greeks called them great ages. The Egyptians called them septepi cycles. The Norse called them world ages. The Hopi called them four worlds. Each age ends in global catastrophe, either by water, fire, ice, or earth upheaval. The last reset was water. The next is fire and electromagnetic disturbance. And every ancient cycle places the length of a full cosmic turn at around 12,000 to 13,000 years. Meaning, we are at the exact end of the same cycle that ended the last world. The cosmic trigger, not climate, but space. Modern science is now confirming what ancient texts described. The flood was triggered by an external cosmic event. NASA, Harvard, and global geophysical studies now confirm. A solar micronova, massive sun outburst, occurred around 12,000 years ago. It triggered rapid melting, ocean rise, and global wildfires. It explains the Younger Dryas extinction event. It explains the layer of charcoal and nanodiamonds found worldwide. It matches the timeline of the ancient flood stories. In other words, White Heavy checkmark the flood was not simply rainfall. White Heavy checkmark it was not only an asteroid. White Heavy checkmark it was not mythology. It was a solar-induced planetary reset. And the sun repeats this cycle every 12,000 years. So what cycle are we in now? Exactly 12,000 years later. The warning encoded into temples and monuments. Why did the ancients build? Pyramids aligned to Orion? Stone circles aligned to solstices? Temples tracking precession, 26,000-year sky cycle. Cities laid out like star constellations? Because they were not honoring the stars. They were tracking time. The sky was their clock of destruction. And when the sky returned to the same alignment as it was 12,000 years ago, that was the signal that the next reset was coming. The alignments are returning now. The elites know, and they are preparing. You don't have to believe ancient myth. Just watch modern power structures. Billionaires are building bunkers. Governments are transferring data into underground vaults. Seed banks are being stored in Arctic vaults. Underground cities are being prepared: Denver, Norway, Switzerland, Australia. Space weather agencies have gone silent on solar data. Patents for electromagnetic shielding have increased. NASA now tracks solar killshot risk as a top existential threat. Why prepare for something that's just mythology? Because they know the cycle is real. And they are not trying to stop it. They are trying to survive it. Just like the priesthoods after the last flood. What the survivors of the last flood wanted us to know. Here is the final truth, pieced together from flood epics, tablets, myths, star maps, and ice core science. White Heavy checkmark the world has been destroyed before. White Heavy checkmark the last destruction was by global flood. White Heavy checkmark it was triggered by a cosmic event, not a local one. White Heavy checkmark a small group survived and rebuilt civilization. White Heavy checkmark they encoded warnings in religion, myth, and stone. White Heavy checkmark they tracked the cycle in the motion of the stars. White Heavy checkmark the cycle is 12,000 to 13,000 years long. White Heavy checkmark we are now at the end of that same cycle. The flood was not a punishment. It was a reset mechanism. Nature resets the world when civilization becomes out of balance. The survivors remembered. We forgot. So what happens next? The ancient texts agree on 3 things before each reset. The climate becomes unstable. People become divided and violent. Leaders hide truth instead of preparing the public. Sound familiar? Modern science adds a 4th sign. The magnetic field of Earth collapses before the event. That is happening right now. The poles are shifting. The field is weakening faster than expected. Navigation systems are compensating. NASA quietly acknowledges pole flip risk. When the magnetic field drops low enough, a solar outburst becomes a planetary-level event. The ancients called it the fire from the sky. The hope the ancients left us. Every surviving text ends the same way. The destruction is not the end. It is the beginning of the next age. The survivors of the last flood did not leave fear. They left instructions for rebuilding. This documentary is not just about the past. It is about the baton being passed across 12,000 years. From the drowned world. To the rebuilding world. To our world. To the next world. Humanity is not ending. It is transitioning. And now we, like the last generation before the flood, must decide. Will we be the erased? Or the remembered? The flood was not the first ending of the world. It was the last warning. And the question is no longer whether it happened, but whether we are ready for when it happens again.